All right, there we go. So we're getting yeses in the chat.
All right. Great. Thank you.
So just talk about
Yeah.
All right.
your better voice.
Yeah.
I can do that. Coach voice. Morning, everyone. I'm Nicole, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Tomasz Falkowski, Assistant Professor in the Department of Forestry. He teaches a variety of courses and has been part of New Mexico Highlands University community for 4 years. A few of the current course offerings and some hopeful courses for next semester include ecosystems and humans, applied ecology, environmental restoration, and social forestry. Please welcome Dr. Tomasz Falkowski as he presents his A2 talk on the Mayan forest garden, lessons for socio-ecological sustainability. We will leave time for question and answers at the end, and please feel free for those of you that are on Zoom to enter questions in the chat.
Thank you. So are they able to see the screen at this point? All right.
Or if you want to share it.
Share the screen, okay.
You can see it, but sharing it.
There we go. Great. No, I will just have to scroll. It's a PDF. All right, so thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I'm just going to dive right in because you guys already know me. So I'm going to try to kind of condense about 4,000 years of history into about 2 minutes here, because that's about as much time as I have in this presentation. So the Maya peoples, they really, their civilization began 2000 BC with the advent of Three Sisters farming. So Three Sisters is a complex polyculture. It's centered around 3 key species: corn, squash, and beans. And these 3 species play complementary roles in terms of the ecological functions that they play in the Maya forest garden. Corn is where most of the calories comes from. It's a very energy-rich starch. And then the beans fix nitrogen, so they provide nutrients for the corn, and then the squash act as a ground cover to retain soil moisture and suppress weeds. And so that's really where I like to think of really the advent of Maya civilization, because this allows for a lot of the complex hierarchies and social development that happens in subsequent years. In turn, we see the development of Maya writing around 7000 BC and sort of the first big Maya city-states forming in Central America in around 100 BC. And this is sort of the start of the so-called classic period of Maya civilization, which lasted till about 1000 AD, so about 1000 years. And subsequently, we had the Maya collapse. And Maya collapse has been popularized in media. There was a movie that came out not too long ago, Apocalypto, that sort of depicts this in a way that I think a lot of Maya were not particularly keen on. Even the idea of the Maya collapse is something that is hotly debated, again, among Maya scholars, because ultimately, right, the Maya is still here. Right, we learned about them in social studies alongside the Aztec and the Inca, and all 3 of those peoples and those cultures are still very much alive and very vibrant. Ultimately, what happened during that collapse period is less that, some sort of cataclysmic event. We're not talking about sort of, extinction of the dinosaurs with a giant asteroid or anything like that. What we see is sort of a confluence of events, tragedies, with a intense drought period where a lot of the traditional forms of agriculture ultimately were not able to provide enough food for people, and also these sort of complex hierarchies that emerged with kings and princes at the center of those nation states demanding a lot of tributes. Turns out that the king's role was to serve as sort of to have conversations with the gods to ensure that the rains were coming, to make sure that society was still functioning. And it turns out when people are going hungry, they say, we don't really need these kings talking to the gods anymore. It seems like they're not doing their job. So why are we going to pay tribute to them? And so we see this depopulation of urban city centers and a move towards a more decentralized, community-oriented way of livelihoods with small communities that are centered around farming. And so, as I mentioned, there are a lot of different Maya groups. There's so some of the groups here are pictured. I've worked with in Chiapas. So we have Chol Maya, Tzotzil Maya, Tzeltal Maya, Lacandon Maya, and all of these groups ultimately they are centered around Maya culture and Maya language, but they are ultimately distinct cultures and in fact distinct language groups. So there is some overlap between, say, Chol Maya and Lacandon Maya. Their word for tortilla is very similar, right? But ultimately they are distinct. They're not understandable to one another. The languages are so distinct. And one of the things that really characterizes Maya people is their forest garden, which is also called the milpa, or the milpa cycle. And the cycle itself, we mentioned corn, squash, and beans as being the three sisters agriculture. A Maya milpa is far more than that. There are up to 100 different crop species and cultivars that are cultivated in Maya milpas, but also it is part of a successional cycle. So we see on the right here a figure of the different stages of the Maya forest garden. So the milpa itself, which is in that top right corner, that'll last for about 1 to 5 years. It will be intensely cultivated with all those different annual crops. Also, they will plant tree crops in among them. But after about 3 to 5 years, I would say, typically fertility begins to decline and weed competition begins to get really bad. And so at that point, the farmers will transition that plot into a stage that is called robir. Now, it's not fallowing in the same way as farmers in the United States might fallow a field, right? It is still very actively managed. They are still planting certain tree species that are going to facilitate subsequent restoration and make sure that the soil is restored and that cultivation can continue moving forward. So after the robir, they divide it up into several other successional stages, depending on how long they are managing it in this more forested stage. And after a certain amount of time, after they have deemed that that plot is ready to be cultivated with a milpa again, they will slash and burn that area, usually small parcels on the order of 1 to 2 hectares, and they will plant that again. So you've got this entire cycle that is mirroring a natural disturbance, right? So you have some sort of disturbance, be it fire, be it a windstorm, something like that, that is removing vegetation, and you see the gradual reintroduction of species, first characterized by herbaceous species, then quick growing pioneers, and then subsequently featuring more woody species and slower growing species that tends to be more shade tolerant. And that has been sort of the mainstay of Maya culture for those 4,000 years since the inception of this form of agriculture. It is one of the most successful human inventions of all time, right? How many things have lasted for 4,000 years in our history, right? I don't know if iPhones will make that list, but it is currently being threatened by a number of factors. And so one of them is expansion of palm oil plantations. This is an African palm that is introduced. It is used industrially to produce palm oil, and a lot of land has been purchased by large companies that are transitioning forest and secondary forest into these palm oil plantations. So there's a lot of competition for land in that regards. Another big shift is the advent of ecotourism. And this one is a little bit like Palm oil, I am not a big fan of, but ecotourism is a little bit more of a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, it is a way to provide livelihoods for very marginalized rural peoples. And they make good money at it, certainly much better than they would working on a farm or something like that. And it's hard for me as an outsider to say, oh, don't go into ecotourism. I'd prefer you practicing traditional life ways when they, I would make the same choice. Yeah. And so at the same time, though, you see a lot of kids following in their footsteps, in parents' footsteps, going into ecotourism, working in the hotel service industry, and they are not learning their traditional life ways. So they're not learning the language. They're not learning how to manage the milpa cycle or how to obtain the goods and services that they need from the forest. So that is a tricky one for me, is sort of the normative value of ecotourism and how that perhaps is both contributing to rural livelihoods, but also undermining traditional life ways. And then finally, is the issue of the burn, right? So as climate change has become a global crisis, we see governments around the world, but particularly in the global south, cracking down on slash and burn, also known as swidden agriculture. And the idea is that slash and burn agriculture is environmentally destructive. It's contributing carbon and contributing to climate change. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but certainly that has been a major push in Mexico as well. There's been a lot of programs that have intended to try to suppress traditional burning practices. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about the fire component of that based on my research moving forward. And the result of that has been conflict, right? A lot of these conservation programs are seen as being advocated by elites, particularly in Mexico City, who are in turn informed and guided by large organizations like the World Bank, United Nations, the RED program, reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, has been another program that has come under fire for its marginalization of indigenous peoples and trying to reduce the autonomy and sovereignty of indigenous peoples on their land. So this has been a very contentious issue. And then on top of it, it turns out not to be very effective, right? All of these big tree planting efforts, it sets up this sort of perverse incentive to actually deforest so that people can then get payments for reforestation. So essentially what people are doing are saying, oh, okay, if I find a forest that happens to be deforested and then plant a bunch of trees, I can get a subsidy for that. Well, people are in turn slashing and burning the forest just so that they can pay for the get paid for the reforestation effort. So there is a lot of problems associated with these sort of conventional models to conservation and restoration in the region. And this is sort of where I come into the picture. So I started working with my PhD advisor, Stu Demont, and he had been working with the Lacandon Maya for the better part of 10 years at the time. And I really was just interested in the tropical rainforest restoration angle, sort of the human traditional ecological knowledge elements. I had no idea about any of that. And over time, that's really where I started finding myself drawn towards. And so the Lacandon Maya are a Maya group. They live in Chiapas, Mexico. So I should say the Maya live throughout Central America, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras. The Lacandon are centered in Chiapas, here in the area around the Montes Azules Biosphere Reserve, right up against the border here with Guatemala. And the history here is kind of interesting. And so they are essentially a refugee group. So in the wake of the Spanish conquest, particularly of the Yucatan Peninsula, a lot of different Maya groups start fleeing, and they flee to where the Spanish don't like to hang out, which is the Lacandon rainforest, because it is You've got poor soils, it's hot, it is very muggy. Their water availability is actually pretty poor, largely because of the karstic bedrock. And so there's not a whole lot going for it in terms of establishing permanent settlements. And so these Maya groups are fleeing to here, and they essentially manage to collectively form the Maya culture, the Lacandon Maya culture, excuse me. And this is characterized really by this deep knowledge of how to coexist in that difficult environment. And I want to say that, this is a difficult environment. The reason I know this is that one time that I was doing field work in Lakan Hachan, which is one of the communities, I started seeing all these film crews and stuff around. And I'm going like, I talked to my collaborator, Adolfo, who you'll see a picture of down the line here. And I say, what's going on? And he goes, los desnudos. And desnudos means the naked ones, right? And I'm like, los desnudos, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, the desnudos, right? They're here, they're filming a thing. And later I find out they're filming an episode of the reality show Naked and Afraid in the village. And he like shows me their like shelter and stuff like that. And I'm like, this looks pathetic. And he's like, yeah, they didn't do great. Which is really funny because there's like a cornfield, there's a milpa, probably with like all the food you could possibly want, like 20 feet away. So needless to say, if you're just trying to do it on your own, it's difficult, but the Maya have developed a really complex way of interacting with their environment to survive there and thrive. And here's a list of a number of different species that are used in the milpa. These are, so some of them are very common, so things like corn, pepper, right? These are things that we all acknowledge, but there's also some really interesting species here. So like rice bean, the Indian shot, yucca. There's really this complex system of food production. And if we look at those secondary forest stages, so here are those stages that I had in that previous figure, and all of the tree species that are being used. So many of them, or actually all of them, have some sort of immediate use that the Lacandon will use for subsistence, right? Either in terms of food, medicine, firewood, timber for construction, a myriad of uses. And then many of them are also found to be enhancing soil fertility. So they are improving nitrogen, they're increasing phosphorus levels in the soil. And there's different mechanisms, the different trees have different, some of them are nitrogen fixers, so similar to beans or peas, they are actually leguminous and fixing nitrogen. Others are serving as sort of nutrient pumps. So their roots go way down, they are pumping up nutrients from those deeper rooting systems, and as the leaves senesce and then fall onto the forest floor, those nutrients are released near the surface where they're going to be more accessible to the more shallow rooted species that we saw earlier on in the milpa. And the overall result here is that diversity tends to increase over time. We can also see, and this is unfortunately completely unreadable on the projector. I promise you on the screen, it does actually look like there are words on here. But what we see is that we see a continuous trend of restoration towards those mature secondary forest conditions. And whereas, looking at the literature in a unmanaged or a pristine, quote unquote, forest in the area, to go through that entire successional process, that's going to take typically around 60 years. With Lacandon management, intentionally planting soil, plants that facilitate soil restoration, that can be down to 40 years, right? So there is a significant acceleration of natural succession, at least in terms of soil fertility. But it also turns out that if we look at the assemblage of species that are using these different areas, we see the same sort of trend, right? So We did a study looking at bird diversity. So we went out there, we did point counts with visual and oral observations. And we found that as we saw the successional stage go up, we also saw the community composition tends towards what we saw in mature protected areas. We see that the bird species richness and diversity is actually maximized at the sort of intermediate stages of that successional trajectory. So where there is the most diverse components of the system are not necessarily the ones that are undisturbed, it's the ones that exhibit this sort of intermediate level of disturbance or an intermediate amount of time since an intense disturbance. So here's some more findings that we had in terms of nutrients. So in general, you can see total soil nitrogen increasing, soil organic matter increasing. Phosphorus was weird. Phosphorus didn't really follow that same pattern, but we do see that certain trees do increase the phosphorus levels. And then there's also interesting effects of certain plants have on plant pests as well. So we were looking particularly at plant parasitic nematodes, and it turns out that they are planting certain trees that have allelopathic chemicals that once their leaves are decomposing in the soil, it creates this sort of artificial, we called it an artificial soil winter, where those pests are not necessarily found immediately around that tree. I touched on the issue of carbon and the burn, and that was the most recent study that we worked in collaboration with the Maya farmers on, because ultimately they wanted to know. They said, look, we've been doing this for thousands of years. Is this really as problematic as the government seems to think it is? And it turns out the answer is yes and no. So I will say that if managed correctly, this slash and burn system can actually increase carbon sequestration in the soil, right? Because what is happening is that the biomass, the carbon that is stored in the biomass, is being converted to very recalcitrant forms of carbon called biochar that, when in the soil, is not going to degrade for around hundreds to thousands of years. Biomass in the system, by contrast, will decompose and be released back into the atmosphere in about a couple of decades. So that's really good. And so if you're creating that biochar through burning and you are restoring all of the above ground vegetation, then you actually are accumulating carbon. So this can act as a carbon sink. The problem is that as the population expands in the area, more people are essentially needing to move further into this agricultural frontier where they are cutting down mature forests, and their cycle is getting faster and faster. So they're not letting that above ground vegetation fully restore and all that carbon to be sequestered yet again. So we do see a net loss of carbon there, but again, at least in principle, in theory, if managed sustainably, this can be a net carbon sink. And this was a chart that I just wanted to present, looking at the decomposition rates of those different forms of carbon. So the blue line at the bottom is maize. So very quick decomposition. This is in herbaceous plants. So that is being decomposed and that carbon is being released very quickly. Whereas the orange and black lines at the top there are very different types of, two different types of char. And so those are decomposing basically at a negligible rate. We looked at the half-lives of that carbon, and we're talking hundreds of years. And this is borne out also in the literature from other studies of indigenous swiddas. However, the interesting thing that we did find, go back here, is that the mean biomass to char conversion rate, so basically we take the biomass and we burn it, how much char is actually produced versus how much of it is just burnt off and released into the atmosphere. We saw about 24% of the carbon being converted into biochar, which for a slash and burn system is like double the rates that we saw like on average in other swidden agro-ecosystems around the world. So This is partially to do with their fire management. So the types of things that they are doing to promote char production, such as quenching flames. They're using wind in a very particular way. There are indigenous peoples, sort of expert fire keepers that are called the wind masters, who are in charge of managing the burns in such a way to maximize char production and also to make sure that the flames don't get out of control. So, we essentially see a pretty complex mechanism for making sure that prescribed burns are being implemented in a sustainable manner. And so you can see some of that in these pictures here. Oops. So that is an early successional stage that has been burned. I think that's a Huruche. And then down here is a much older stage that has been burned. You also note that there's a lot of incomplete combustion that's happening here in addition to the char production. A lot of that carbon is still remains as woody debris in these systems. I'm going to skip over this. That's more nutrient stuff. But what you can see in these photos, these were taken, these are different plots. We were conducting an experiment looking at restoration of forest using 3 different methods. C and D are using the milpa cycle and that traditional agroforestry system. And then A and B are a control. So this is passive restoration. We're just letting the system go. And here is an intentional plantation style reforestation efforts where people are walking and they're replanting trees at set intervals. And what we found is that although milpa, the milpa cycle was slower to be restored, at a certain point, the rates or the trajectories of the control and the plantation style reforestation, they ultimately intersected with the Maya agroforestry system. So you're getting all of those ecological benefits, but you're also getting a lot of food. You're getting a lot of medicine, fuel wood. And you're preserving indigenous lifeways in managing the forest that way. So essentially what we're arguing for here is that this traditional agroforestry system can be used in restoration efforts in a way that actually respects and protects indigenous sovereignty, as opposed to these other two, which ultimately are not necessarily counter to indigenous sovereignty, but don't take into account that traditional ecological knowledge. And so that is ultimately what we found from that research. But I think the broader lessons, and I think, some people may have come to talk for the nitty-gritty science stuff, but I think that the big picture lessons here are the ones that I think I'm most excited about and that I've learned the most from. And so a lot of it has to do with how do we do restoration? And I think this applies not just in Chiapas, but also here in New Mexico, right? So oftentimes we see ecological restoration as a technical activity, right? It's something that foresters do. It's something that ecologists do, applying ecological theory. And that's true. I'm not saying let's throw out ecological theory, but I also think that there is a lot to be learned in how we do the restoration to make sure that it's more sustainable. So making sure that our involvement is truly broad and inclusive, right? This can't just be something that technocrats do that is handed down from the halls of government. This has to be done in communion with local communities to make sure that they are feeling valued, that they are feeling included in the process, and that they also have a vested interest in that process. It has to be adapted to the local conditions of the landscape. And I mean both the social cultural landscape and the ecological landscape. There can't be these one-size-fits-all silver bullet approaches to restoration. And so, that plantation style, that reforestation style, I think that's very valuable in some places, but in others where indigenous communities or rural communities are nearby, maybe we need to shift the focus of restoration to think about different approaches. And some of that might mean a continuum of activities. So if we look at the Society for Ecological Restoration principles for restoration design, there is a real tendency to emphasize biophysical indicators. There is really very little consideration to social benefits, economic benefits, cultural benefits, right? And so, sure, we can measure restoration success in terms of, okay, what is the biomass? How many trees have survived? But what about if we also measured how many school kids we engaged in that? What if we looked at civic engagement as a metric of restoration success? I think that might make our designs far more inclusive and more sustainable down the line. And that might not mean maintaining perfectly mature, unaltered forests. Maybe we've got some agroforests. Maybe we've got some silvopastures that integrate cattle. And that might be fine. One of my, I have the pleasure and honor of having Robin Kimmerer on my PhD committee. And one of her common things, or common refrains, is reciprocity with the natural world. You know, and restoration, I think, is really one of the ways in which we can show reciprocity for the gifts that the natural world gives to us. And in restoring this ecosystem, we restore our relationship to it. And suddenly we recognize all of the impacts that we have, not just negative, also potentially the positive impacts. I think environmentalism in the global north in the United States is vaguely misanthropic. Right? There's the famous Pogo cartoon of we have met the enemy and he is us. And that is the view of humanity when it comes to environmental relations. But restoration really serves as an example in which humans can have a vitalizing and diversifying role in the ecosystem. Make sure that we include many voices in restoration, not just those of ecologists and those with technical or sort of formalized technical experience, because certainly land managers here in Mexico, be they farmers, hunters, ranchers, they all have a wealth of information that they would very much love to be listened to, right? And so making sure that we're including those voices in the conversation. So making sure that biocultural diversity is something that we focus on. I already alluded to the fact that by and large, restoration approaches in the global north are very biophysically oriented, right? How many species are there? What is the basal area of the trees in an area that we are restoring? But making sure that we also take time to preserve the cultural lifeways of the peoples who have lived in this place and make sure that we are respecting those relationships rather than trying to erase them from the landscape. Unfortunately, conservation and restoration have a colonial legacy, right? We look at a lot of land management and that bears the fingerprint of colonization. Still to this day, there's this concept of fortress conservation, where the way that we protect an area is by keeping people out and in some cases evicting them from an area. And so making sure that we actually acknowledge these traditional settlement patterns, that we acknowledge the cultural ties that people have to the landscape and recognize the benefits that that could have, right? Because oftentimes these traditional lifeways are increasing the diversity. They are increasing the productivity of a site. Now, this doesn't mean an anything goes approach, right? Certainly there are traditional patterns that I think are maladapted to at least the current conditions, right? This goes back to the thing about Swidden agriculture about, okay, Swidden agriculture can be managed sustainably, but maybe with current populations, maybe it can't, right? So thinking about how we shift our thinking about this to think about how it could be incorporated into land management in a sustainable way. Another principle that the Lekanda Maya take into account that I think we really need to do is facilitate internal recycling and reduce external inputs without reducing redundancy. There's this idea of the efficiency paradox, right? So like, for instance, there's this concept of like lean manufacturing or the, Toyota's principle of like, okay, we just need one of these things, right? And we will replace it if it breaks, but we don't want the redundancy. That's the most efficient model, right? But that doesn't create a lot of resilience, if one thing breaks down, suddenly the whole system has the potential to collapse. So making sure that we have a diversity of functional groups that we can take into account, and also make sure that there are replacements in place and using the resources that are already there. I have a rather dim view of certain approaches to restoration, which use a lot of external energy when in fact, we could be leveraging local community resources and involving communities more in that effort. Taking into account resilience and adaptability through diversity and embracing change. So making sure that change is not something that we fight against. It's the one constant in life is change. And often when we think about environmental management, we have sort of the approach that is probably 10 to 20 years out of date. And so making sure that we take that adaptivity into account and we are planning for future conditions. That's especially true in the face of global climate change. So making sure that we are embracing that rather than trying to fight against it. And that's also going to help with the energy inputs because often fighting change is very energy intensive. Making sure that we incentivize long-term monitoring and maintenance, and that ties into that community engagement component, right? In Chiapas, as well as here in New Mexico, like the Forest Service is stretched thin in terms of their monitoring efforts, engaging local communities through the restoration and building that tie so that they feel a vested interest can also increase interest in that long-term monitoring. And so you're essentially able to leverage citizen science to make sure that that restoration is successful in the long term, because by and large, when we are doing restoration projects here in the United States, they are dictated by their success monitoring is dictated by a grant cycle. So about 5 years, so what happens beyond that 5 years? We have some long-term field sites, but really, as we've seen, a lot of these different sites may exhibit very, very different trajectories. So having that on local connection for long-term monitoring is really important. And then finally, making sure that we promote participatory governance, sovereignty, and socioeconomic equity in our restoration designs. And so that's a lot of buzzwords, I acknowledge, but I do believe that restoration has the capacity for being not just a mechanism for improving the health of ecosystems, but also improving the health of our human communities as well. I've seen restoration be a joyful thing, and here in the wake of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire, we're talking with land managers who have participated in restoration workshops, and they have gone from a feeling of hopelessness to a feeling of hope. It is a way of healing trauma, not just in the landscape, but also within ourselves, and making sure that everybody has access to that, not just those with financial resources, but also those who are marginalized for one reason or another, that they are also included in that potential benefit is a really important. All right, so I want to take a moment to thank all of my colleagues, and particularly the Lacandon Maya colleagues who have helped me, right? I am here standing in front of you giving this presentation, but really I am just a translator. I am just taking the knowledge that they have shared with me and putting it in terms that we here in the Academy in the United States can appreciate. And so in particular, I want to thank Isaias Martinez, who's up there in the top left in the rope swing, and also Adolfo Chanquin, who are two of my close friends and colleagues and really brilliant indigenous scientists and really just huge mentors and inspirations for me. There's nothing more than I would like to be than a farmer scientist. So I appreciate the goodness of them. So with that, I think I want to make sure that we have time for questions. Thank you.
Any questions in the chat? Any in the room while we're waiting?
Yeah, one. This may be a two-part question.
Okay.
So what is the kind of Maya governance structure for land?
Uh-huh.
In the United States, we have all these like land ownership
Mhm.
things. And how do you think that plays into the some of the success of this agricultural biodiversity system?
Yeah, really good question. So I'll actually turn that into a three-parter and you'll see how I answer that. So one is there are diverse sort of land ownership and structures and governance structures. So I would say there's two main ones for the Maya. One is that there are a lot of Maya communities that are ejido communities. So as part of land reforms that started in the mid 1900s, land grants were given to communities, and in turn, there's a central committee that allocates parcels of land. So, the community ultimately makes decisions, but when it comes to an individual piece of land, it's sort of up to the individual who has been told, okay, you've got the parcel over here, your neighbor has the parcel over there, and there is autonomy there. But there is also a collective decision-making structure sort of at a higher level. So those are the ejidos. And I should say that those lands are granted to the community. There was a constitutional amendment that was tried to pass in the 1990s, I want to say, that would privatize those lands. And it was one of the reasons that there was a huge popular uprising against that, because essentially it would open up the apportioning of the collective lands, not public land, but collective lands into private lands. And the Lacandon, though, they're sort of a special case. They have been granted essentially what constitutes kind of like tribal lands. It's an autonomous zone. And it is not an ejido in the same sense as the other areas of the other Maya groups. But there is collective decision making. There's a committee that allocates land, but there's a lot more sort of autonomy at the individual family level as to where you are farming. So it's slightly different. And the third part of that I wanted to highlight is that there is a parallel to New Mexico, right, with the history of land grants. In this case, it was from the Spanish crown back in Spanish colonial days, not the Mexican government, but nonetheless, there is that history of collective land ownership, and the sort of transition to private land ownership is exactly what the Maya are afraid it would happen if that 1990s amendment to the Constitution had passed. So there's another interesting sort of parallel there in terms of the governance structure.
Anyone else in the room?
I will say, so just before I wrap up, so since I do have this opportunity, as mentioned that I am interested in teaching a class on social forestry, and the intention there is to bring our undergraduate and graduate students down to Chiapas to learn about this and other traditional agroforestry methods, and then connect that to practices here in New Mexico. This would be a study abroad course that would be running in the summer of 2024. And part of what I'd like to advertise here is that I'm hoping to open it up to alumni so that alumni donations and also fees can go towards supporting students' travel for that international study abroad course. So if you have interest in supporting that, you want more information about that potential travel as details emerge, my email is there. I think that you can also find my email on the Department of Forestry website, and get in touch with me, and I'll release details as they are available.
We do have one
Oh,
question
great.
from William Chervenko.
Okay. Yeah.
William, if you want to unmute.
Sure. Great talk, Tomasz. Just curious on some of the other land management stuff. Is there any kind of animal integration in for that? Kind of one of the those healthy soil principles. So are they integrating animals in to these milpas much? And then also with kind of land clearing and removal, that kind of early successional disturbance, I guess. Is there much of a problem with invasive species or noxious weeds, or is the native vegetation so I don't want to say aggressive, but so aggressive that it just fights back any kind of that?
Yeah, great questions. So as far as the animal agricultural components of that, like and don't do a whole lot of that. I mean, certainly there has been change in that traditional system over time. It has evolved. But they didn't have domesticated animals when that milpa system was really getting started, or at least most of the livestock that we see now, they didn't have. So most of the meats that they are getting is from hunting from those secondary forest stages. So they're encouraging that wildlife to come into areas where they can hunt for it. And that's still practiced to this day. Some of the other Maya groups, particularly the Chol Maya do seem to be integrating more cattle, so more of a silvo pasture system into the milpa. But I would say it's done at a very small scale. There is more kind of, I wouldn't say industrial because it's not a CAFO, it is still pasture raised cattle, but there are larger ranches that are held by companies and people from out of state in Chiapas, but they are generally not going to be Maya. And then the other question you had was about the weed competition. So yes, weeds and invasives can be a problem. And that is part of the adaptations that have come in, where now we're seeing much more intention among Maya farmers given to this planting tree species immediately before fallowing. Again, not really fallowing, but before allowing a milpa transition into those secondary forest stages, so that there is canopy cover that's getting started that will shade out some of those really aggressive colonizer weed species. So we see a lot more of that, at least based on conversations with farmers. That is something that they are paying far more attention to nowadays.
Anybody else in the room?
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really